So,
Ready, go.
Candy and I decided that we wanted to do the study of Daniel, and we're going to try to go through a lot of Daniel this week, just to try to get things done faster than we were doing them with Acts and with Luke. So, introduction to the book of Daniel. Daniel is both the main character and the author of the book, and the book ranges for 70 years, spanning from Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem and the first wave of the Jewish exiles into the third year of the Persian king Cyrus. Daniel and his three friends are in the first group to be taken to Babylon. It's likely that Daniel and his friends were of the royal line of David, but we don't know that for sure. We do know that if they weren't of the royal line, then they were definitely noble blood. And they were considered like Jerusalem or Israel's best. And Daniel was alive at the same time as two other prophets that are in the Old Testament. So Ezekiel, who was probably around the same age as Daniel, was another prophet who was living in Babylon at the same time, but he probably came a little bit later than Daniel, and it's likely that he didn't live like in the palace the same way that Daniel did. And then Jeremiah was also a prophet, and he's a little bit older, and he was living in Jerusalem at the same time, and all of them were prophesying about what was happening to the children of Israel at that time. So, the book has two main purposes: to share a hope for the future, because at that point it looked rather bleak. I mean, they had just been exiled and they had been conquered, and God had been telling them how naughty you have been doing because you keep sinning. And yet Daniel's book is all about God's hope and how it's not always going to be like this. And the second is sharing God's sovereignty. Throughout the entire book, God only wants people to listen to him and humble themselves and come to him in repentance and to stop sinning. Literally, that's like, if you get one thing out of this, get that. And the book is a blend of personal testimony, history, and prophecy. Chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, and it introduces the historical setting and Daniel and Hezekiah, or Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, And chapter 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, which wasn't necessarily a Jewish language, but it was the language of trade at the time. And it describes the rise and fall of four dominant kingdoms. And then in chapters 8 through 12, we switch back to Hebrew again, and it's the prophecy about the Jewish people being dominated by other nations, God's timing for Jesus to come, and the deliverance of the Jews.
All right. So for today, Sarah and I are going to talk about chapters 1 through 7. And chapter 1 introduces us to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as you know them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar was really shrewd in his tactics. He basically used the four men as a way of reminding Jerusalem that the Babylonians were in control and that they shouldn't disobey their rules. These four represented the best and brightest of Judah's future, and the king basically had them in his control now too. The first thing Nebuchadnezzar did was give them new Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had traditional Babylonian food that the king would eat, and a Babylonian education, because basically he wanted to make sure that they left behind their Hebrew God and culture and looked to him, the king, for everything. In the same way, Satan kind of does that with us today. He wants us to feed on what the world has to offer, identify ourselves in reference to the world, and educate ourselves in the ways of the world. But Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to look to anyone other than God. Daniel refused to eat the king's food, and he knew that he needed to be faithful even in the littlest of things, like which food to eat. Through all of it, Daniel shows us how to position ourselves in a time of trial. We have to purpose our heart or make up our minds beforehand that we will not compromise and trust in God. God doesn't ever abandon us when we stand for him.
Sorry. Okay, chapter 2. We switch from Hebrew to Aramaic now, and the king Nebuchadnezzar has this really weird dream, which I feel like most of you, if you've been through Sunday school, you've heard of this dream. There's a statue, and it's made of gold at the top, and it has silver for the chest and the arms, bronze for the belly and the thighs, iron for the legs, and a clay iron mixture for the feet. And Nebuchadnezzar is kind of weirded out just by looking at the statue, but while he's looking at the statue, there's this huge rock that is not like cut out by human hands. It's just a natural rock, and it comes out of nowhere and it smashes the statue at the feet, but it basically powderizes the entire statue, and it's blown away in the wind. And then where the rock lands, a mountain comes up. And this mountain is a giant mountain, one that anyone in the world can see kind of mountain. And Nebuchadnezzar is a little bit freaked out, and he's like, what's happening right now? I don't understand. And he wakes up, and he then is like, okay, well, I want to know what's up with this dream, but I kind of want to know that the gods actually tell me what's happening. So I'm not going to tell my wise people what actually happened. I want them to tell me, and I want them to interpret the dream. And so he calls his wise people, which at that time, Daniel and his 3 buddies, they're still new, so they weren't considered wise men yet. And they aren't called in this group. But, sad to say, if the wise men who were called didn't answer, then Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill Daniel and his friends along with everyone else. So when the wise men are like, we can't tell you what happened in the dream because you're not telling us what happened in the dream. We can't just read your mind. That's impossible. So Nebuchadnezzar is like, okay, well then I'm going to go kill you guys. And he goes after, and he actually sends someone to try to find Daniel so he can put Daniel and his friends to death. And Daniel talks to the guy who's looking for him, and he's like, can you not kill us right now? I would like to try to see if me and my friends can figure this out. So they go back. Well, Daniel goes, and he tells his friends, and they spend the whole night praying. And in the night, Daniel gets this revelation from God of what happens, or what had happened in the dream. And God explains to him, the whole story. And so he sees the statue, he sees the rock, he sees the mountain. And God explains that the statue is 4 kingdoms. And it was the gold, the head was Babylon. And the silver was the Medes and the Persians, so the arms and the chest area. And then the belly and the thighs were the kingdom of Greece. And the legs and the feet were the Romans. So the legs was the Romans before the empire fell, and the feet were probably the Romans when they became nation states, and they weren't quite as strong as they had been, and a lot of them crumbled throughout history. And Daniel goes and he says, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, please don't kill us. God, and he was always this is one of my favorite parts about Daniel, he was never ever one to try to take credit. Mm-hmm. And he always gave credit to God, because he knew there's no possible way that without God I could tell you what happened in this dream or what the meaning of this dream is. So he goes and he says, Nebuchadnezzar, stop freaking out. It's okay. This is what it's about. And he says, God told me in this kingdom that was definitely pagan, he said, my God, the one who is alive, the one who's actually real. When you guys worship these rocks, my God told me what happened. And this is why he is a real, true God. And so he goes through the description, and Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, yeah, your God is true, because that is exactly what happened in my dream. Thank you for telling me.
All right. Chapter 3 in the story of the fiery furnace is one that many of you are familiar with. Nebuchadnezzar orders the 7 groups of government officials to come to the dedication of the gold statue that he had built. This idea that he demanded all of the officials to come is really a telltale sign that he's using this as a test of allegiance. And as you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow and worship to the statue or Nebuchadnezzar. They obeyed the word of God above the word of the king. And when Nebuchadnezzar interrogated the 3 of them, it was an even greater test of allegiance. It's one thing to be faithful to God, but far more difficult to remain faithful when you're face to face with a king who's known for his cruel punishments for disobedience. It kind of reminds me, even Peter faltered when pushed. Peter followed Jesus after his arrest, but then when he was asked if it was true, Peter even denied Jesus. So it's just harder when you're face to face like that. My favorite part of this story is their response to the king. They declare that their God will deliver them from the fire and from you, Nebuchadnezzar. They understood the greatness of God's power in that moment. But then they go on to say in verse 18, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. They knew God's power, but they also knew that they had to do what was right, even if God didn't respond in the way they expected him to. They never doubted God's ability, but they didn't presume to know God's will either. So anyways, the men are violently thrown into the fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they end up being exalted by the king, who now believes their God is the true God.
Second time.
Yep.
So this brings us to chapters 4 and 5, which parallel each other. One story is about Nebuchadnezzar after all of this has happened, and the other one is about his son. So in chapter 4, we find Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. This time, he's willing to tell the wise people what actually happened, but again, the wise people can't tell him the interpretation of it. So in the dream, he sees this really big tree. It's a huge tree, a tree that people everywhere, anywhere can see. And in the tree are birds and small animals, and then underneath the tree are other animals, and there's just all these creatures that are living in this tree, and it's a beautiful tree that has fruit and all this greatness, and it's just gorgeous. Well, then a messenger, as what it says in the Bible, comes and wants to chop the tree down. And he doesn't really understand why, but the messenger will leave the roots and the stump, and all the animals end up leaving because their home's gone. And Nebuchadnezzar is very troubled. So he first tells all of the wise men, and then after they fail, he goes and tells Daniel. And Daniel sits there and is like, do I have to tell you? Please don't make me tell you. If only this was about your enemies. And Nebuchadnezzar is like, okay, I'm not going to be mad at you. Just tell me what happened. And he's like, okay, well, the tree is you, and you're being bad, and you need to stop. You're exalting yourself over God, and you've done this a few times now, even though you've admitted in the past that my God is the God. You still are being not humble with him, and he wants you to stop. And if you don't, you're gonna go crazy and you're gonna live like an animal and you're gonna be eating grass like a cow and drinking dew. Isn't that fun? And Nebuchadnezzar starts off going, yeah, I'm not gonna do that, sorry. And almost instantly he loses his mind and he lives like an animal, and he had to learn the hard way, because that's what Nebuchadnezzar and most of us, I mean, let's face it, I learned the hard way too.
Yep.
It's true. And after living like an animal for 7 years, he looks up to heaven and he's like, okay, God, I'm sorry. Like, I humble myself before you. I apologize for being a wretched, sinful king. Please forgive me. And God does. He restores everything. He comes back. He's able to come back to the kingdom, which is surprising, because that kind of world, 7 years being gone, he must have had some very trusted people taking care of the kingdom. He comes back. He's restored as king. He's able to go back to life as normal, basically. The next chapter, chapter 5, we see Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belteshazzar, and he knows about what happened with his father. More than likely, he probably saw some of the other previous stories about, like, Daniel and his friends getting in hard places and being saved by God. More than likely, he's seen those kind of things too. Yet, he had to learn the hard way too. So, he gets all of the cool people he wants together in a room, and he's like, we're gonna have a party, and we're gonna worship the gods of silver and the gods of gold and bronze and iron and wood, and we're gonna drink out of the goblets that they got from the kingdom of Jerusalem in the temple. We're gonna drink from those. Basically, a slap in the face to God. And God gets righteously upset. And he comes down, and we see a hand, only a hand, and it starts writing on the wall. And of course, because they see a disembodied hand writing on the wall, they all start freaking out, and they're like, what is happening right now? And Belteshazzar is like, okay, I will award whoever can read this and tell me what's happening, but please, I'm freaking out here. Like, I gotta know what's going on. And everyone can't read it, of course. It makes me wonder about the wise people there, really. And the queen mother, who was Belshazzar's mother, she looked at him and said, hey, do you remember your father? He had this wise guy. His name was Daniel. You should go find him and get him to read it. So he goes, he finds Daniel. Daniel comes, he looks at the wall, and he's like, haven't you learned from your father? Really? Like, you have to do this too? Fine. So he interprets the message. And the message is, you have been weighed and found wanting. God has numbered your days, which God has numbered your days is listed twice. You have been weighed and found wanting. The Medes and Persians are coming. And Belteshazzar says, thank you so much. But he does absolutely nothing. He doesn't change any of his behaviors. He doesn't say, oh, I am so sorry, God. I did not know what I was doing. I was an idiot. Please forgive me. Put the temple relics back. No, he doesn't do any of that. He gives Daniel all the gold chain around his neck. He gives him a purple robe. And then that night, the Medes and the Persians come, and Belteshazzar is murdered. Why? Because he didn't listen. Or humble himself.
All right, and that brings us to chapter 6. So chapter 6 parallels chapters 1 and 3, and it is the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and it's another one that most of you are probably familiar with. In chapter 6, we find Daniel being placed as an administrator over the other government officials. Daniel's distinguished himself above the others and is set to be the king's right-hand man, so to speak. This infuriates the others so much that they try to find fault with Daniel. But they soon come to realize that they can't find anything that Daniel has done or said to find fault with. They realize that they will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Could you imagine us having a government official that has no flaws in their character or their actions? Basically, no, right? I know. I'm like, I think about some of them that are up there. I'm like, yeah,
No.
not a single one of them has no faults. But basically, there were no skeletons in Daniel's closet. So when his enemies examined his life, they found nothing to attack, so they had to make something up. They create a law that states nobody could worship anyone other than the king for 30 days. And they told the king that all of the royal administrators agreed with the decree, which we know Daniel would never agree to. Daniel was confronted with a test of loyalties. Either continue to be a loyal subject of the king or be loyal to God. Daniel knew that God was the King of Kings and deserved a far greater loyalty, so he did as he always did and continued to pray 3 times a day despite the consequences. When King Darius found out about Daniel, he was displeased with himself. He wasn't displeased with Daniel or Daniel's enemies. He was displeased with himself. And my question for you is why? And I'll let you answer that in the comments below. Regardless of how mad the king was at himself, he had Daniel cast into the lion's den. But before he did, he told Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Daniel's consistent life of service to God was his testimony, and Daniel shared that daily with those around him, including the king. The next day, the king called in to see if Daniel was still alive, and the king was overjoyed when he heard Daniel's voice. Daniel, and Sarah, you mentioned this earlier, but Daniel does it again. He gives credit to God for saving him, and Darius had him pulled out of the den and his enemies thrown into the den. The story ends with a new decree from the king that everyone was to fear and reverence the God of Daniel. And that wouldn't have happened had Daniel not given credit to God. So that's kind
Right?
of cool.
Yeah.
So.
That's part of I think that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy doing this study, is just because you see over and over Daniel is like, I am not the wise person you think I am.
Right.
Stop it. It's not me. Which
Yeah.
I can identify with. I really can.
But it's easy to get caught up, and it's cool that Daniel doesn't. He doesn't get caught up with the fame or notoriety of being that person, that go-to person.
Yes.
He always gives credit back.
Definitely. So, chapter 6 was the last story types chapter that we find in the book of Daniel. Chapter 7 is where we start seeing the prophecy of Daniel, which honestly for me personally was very difficult to read, especially when I was your guys' age. I would read it and just be like, huh? I'm sorry, what?
That's why I gave it to you. Sorry, Pastor.
That's okay though. So chapter 7, according to some scholars, they believe that the chapter 7 is talking about future events, but other more scholars believe that chapter 7 parallels chapter 2, which the way the Bible Project had it set up, they obviously fall under the second category where they believe it parallels. Honestly, I kind of can see both, where it parallels and yet it could be talking about the future, because in my study of Daniel, I've noticed that it talks a lot about the end times. So I could see it being a both and kind of situation. So chapter 7, Daniel's dream, which is very weird. I'm not gonna lie, it's a really weird, if I had that kind of dream, I would wake up probably shaking. It's weird. But the cool thing is that he gets an interpretation while he is in the dream, because it is that's I feel like how you know it's a God kind of dream, because Daniel is dreaming, and in his dream he's able to ask someone who's there, probably an angel who was there, and he is able to be like, what did I just see here? Because what did I just see? And they were able to tell him. That is super cool to me. And honestly, I feel like that's how you would know, like, this is God, because he doesn't want to leave you questioning things. Like, if you have a question, you can ask him. And that's the really cool thing about God, at least to me. So, Daniel's dreaming. First, he sees 4 rather odd-looking beasts. The first one is a lion with the wings of an eagle. Eventually, those wings get torn off. Very fun. The second is a bear with a rib cage in his mouth. 3 ribs you see visible, and he's tearing the flesh off of the ribs, and someone, an angel I'm assuming, tells the bear to eat its fill of flesh, which honestly, if I was a fan of ribs, I might not be anymore. Then the third is a 4-headed leopard with 4 wings like a bird. And the fourth is it didn't actually give an animal description. It said a very terrifying, a very powerful beast with iron teeth, and I think it said brass feet or something, but the iron teeth devoured its victims, and the beast had 10 horns. Now, the 10 horns, the Bible Project said that the horns represented kings back in the days of Daniel. Like, when you saw a horn, you would think king. And so the horns represented kings of that kingdom that was on that beast. And out of those 10 horns, one little one comes kind of out of nowhere, and 3 of the original horns fall off and are displaced by that one little one. That one little one had eyes like a man and a mouth like a man, and started boasting and started saying all these horrible things about God and the Almighty, like the Ancient of Days, as it was called in the dream. And he started being boastful and started being very, well, Antichrist. If you didn't catch it, that's what that was. He was the Antichrist. And so he was boasting and being very, like, he was trying to claim power that was God's. He was trying to be like, God isn't as good as I am, and blah 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 blah. Well, then we see 2 thrones, and we see the Ancient of Days, whose head is white as wool, and he sits down, and now this is really this is part of the trippy part. So his throne first has wheels, second has flames coming out of it, and where it's sitting is a river of fire that's flowing out from it. And all this time, there's the beast and the horn that's talking, and it's being a very annoying horn. And then we see the Son of Man, and he comes on heaven's clouds, and he sits next to the Ancient of Days. And the beast and its horn get killed, and they get thrown into the river of fire, which honestly I picture lava. I mean, I don't know for sure if it's lava or not, but I just picture lava whenever I picture a river of fire. So they get thrown into this river of fire or lava or whatever, which I can't imagine it would feel very good. That flowed out from underneath where the throne of the Ancient of Days is. And Daniel sees this whole thing, and he's like, what did I just see? And he goes and he asks an angel, well, I think it was an angel, I don't know for sure if it was. He asked someone who was in the dream, and they answer, and they say, okay, those 4 beasts, those are 4 kingdoms. And this is where we see the parallel of what is happening in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because again, it's 4 kingdoms. The first kingdom would have represented Babylon, So that was the lion with the wings of an eagle. And then the bear with the ribs in its mouth would have been the next kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. And then the four-headed leopard with the four wings of bird, that would have been the Greek kingdom. And then the nondescript, terrifying creature would have been the Roman kingdom. And likely the 10 horns would have mimicked the 10 toes that we saw on the statue. And this is where I kind of see the both and, because as far as I know, we have not seen, or at least he hasn't revealed himself yet, the Antichrist. And that's why I can see, like, this very likely could have been from the Roman kingdom, but it can also be pointing towards the future. And so ultimately the whole idea of this dream is at the end, when the beast with the annoying horn gets thrown into this lake of fire, the river of fire, not lake of fire, sorry, talking about other books there. And the throne of the Ancient of Days and the throne of the Son of Man, which, in case you didn't know, the Son of Man would have been Jesus, which the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the huge rock that was cut out by non-human hands, it would have been cut out by God, that often represents Jesus as well. And the fact that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream it came and it hit the toes first, and then it crumbled the entire statue, and the mountain that came up out of it was a large mountain, the one that anyone anywhere could have seen. We see the same kind of imagery at the end of this dream, where the Son of Man wins. He throws this annoying creature with the annoying horn into the river of fire, and he wins. He gets to sit next to the Ancient of Days, and it's a kingdom, a huge kingdom, another giant kingdom, one that can be seen from anywhere, in like anywhere near it they can see it, mimicking the same dream that we see from Nebuchadnezzar. And I really enjoyed that. It was super cool. I'm a geek. I'm okay. Like,
now I have to go back and watch the video and read chapter 7 again so I can read it with your notes. All right. Throughout the Bible, humans are depicted as the royal image of God. We're given dominion over animals and can rule over them on God's behalf. But as we know, all of us, God's people, we mess all of that up. We forget our place in God's kingdom. We try to make ourselves the authority. Maybe not intentionally, we don't necessarily say I'm better than God, but we become less humble and we forget to give God the credit. But when we rebel against God like that, we become like beasts, and we see that through many of the dreams and visions that were in the book of Daniel. But the book itself is all about God's sovereignty. Sovereignty over bringing blessing and protection to those who are faithful, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And then God's sovereignty over the kings, the nations, and the empires of the world.
Mm-hmm. Also, ultimately, I feel like the running theme throughout Daniel, which I said before, like, you get one thing out of this. Just remember, like, people ultimately would lose because they spoke out against God, which is exactly what you were saying. Like, we saw kings rise and fall. Why? Because they spoke out against God, or because they did something that was against God. In the dreams, we saw kingdoms being crashed by rocks, or animals being thrown into rivers of fire, because they were speaking out against God, or because just inherently their kingdom would have been against God. I mean, Romans were not exactly very nice people, and neither were the Greeks, and neither were the Medes and the Persians, and neither was Babylon. None of them. I mean, Babylon was always a picture of like the enemy And even after Babylon fell, they still talked about Babylon being the enemy. And they always used it as a picture of this is like rebelling against God, and just inherently. So I feel like the main point of this is just, yeah, you want to follow what God is saying, and you want to repent, and you want to like turn from whatever horrible things may be in your mind or you're doing, and turn to God, because in the end he's gonna win, and he's proven that over and over. And yeah.
All right, so that's it for this week. Next week we're going to finish off the book of Daniel. And so if you have thoughts on what to do after next week, certainly let us know.
Otherwise, we might do Isaiah.
That's kind of where we're leaning otherwise. So, but if you've got something else you want us to talk about, certainly let us know. See ya.
Bye.
Turn off. It's not turning off.